sprint, which I'll talk about later. But yeah, the one thing I want to clarify with the Wednesday evening trainings is that they're orienteering training on a sprint map. So not every week are we running an actual orienteering sprint, but it's always training on a sprint map. So typically the courses are longer than a sprint would be. Nobody wants to drive over town for a 12-minute run. So one thing to keep in mind there. And then our big thing is our annual sprint camp. So this year we celebrated our 15th annual. The camp started back in 2005, much smaller at the time. Now we get over 100 participants a year. And we do, if you haven't been, it's a ton of fun. We do 5 trainings and 5 races in a single weekend. So it's quite packed. So now I'm going to talk a bit about sprint orienteering. I'm sure everybody hopefully knows what sprint orienteering is and has run a few. The idea is orienteering in a setting where running speed is not impeded by the terrain. So you want top speed runability. There's an emphasis on route choice. Actually finding the control shouldn't be the difficult part. It should be choosing and executing the right route under the pressure of the speed. I took this bullet from the IOF's description of sprint, and I find that to be what makes a sprint a good sprint to me. So the course should be set to require the athlete's full concentration throughout the race. When you run a proper hard sprint course, you really see this sense of sustained difficulty. At the end, you're like, wow, what did I just do? And it's because it takes your mental focus the whole time. And then there's some interesting things about sprints, like dead-end traps, out-of-bounds areas, mandatory crossings, places where you can be in the same spot on the map, but on 2 different levels. All of those are challenges that are specific to sprint orienteering. So where did it come from? If you're fairly new to orienteering, you might think of sprint as being quite normal, but it's actually relatively young. And I remember, as I'm sure most of you do, when the Canadian Championships and other big events were 2-day total time events, classic distances, quite different than the sprint middle long format we're used to today. So the sprint first debuted at the World Championships in 2001 in Finland, and this is the map. You can see still here, it looks quite different than the maps we're used to today, and that's because they hadn't yet developed the international specification for sprint orienteering mapping. So that came in a little later. Back at that time, the World Championships were still every 2 years. So in 2003, we see the map looking more like we're used to. However, if you go back and look at some of these first sprints, you'll notice that they lack the sustained difficulty that I was talking about. So when you look at a new championship level sprint, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's hard all the time. On the local scene, the sprint first debuted in the COCs, Canadian Championships, in 2006 in Toronto, only 1 year after sprint camp started. And you can see here, it was a forest sprint. And then the first proper urban sprint was the following year in Saskatoon. There was still kind of some forest sprints on and off as the years went on. Personally, I love a good forest sprint, but they don't have those same, traps, multi-levels, some of those same sprint-specific challenges. I wanted to take an opportunity here to talk about the sprint standard. So there I showed you a bit of a progression of maps from the orienteering standard to the sprint standard to a newer version of the sprint standard. As of January 1st, 2020, the 2019 International Specification for Sprint Orienteering Mapping is the active standard. So it'll probably be a while before maps that you run on get updated to this. We updated just the ones we used for spring camp this year to this. So, but eventually all the maps we run on will be the standard. So it's good to know it's coming. Here I wanted to highlight 3 things that I think are most important. The first is the impassable vegetation color. So previously this dark green was used for illegal to cross vegetation. So mostly hedges, sometimes kind of not flower beds, but vegetation features that they didn't want you to run through. Flower beds would usually be olive green. And so they've changed that to be the same as the darkest vegetation color. So I think this is important, again, because in sprint, impassable means illegal to pass. Not necessarily you physically cannot pass. So that's the first one. Next, I want to highlight the new multi-level symbol. So previously, these dots were used as, they're called the tunnel symbol, to indicate that this right here would be runnable on the top level. You could cross this bridge, and runnable underneath. You could pass underneath it. A lot of athletes, everyone probably, had difficulty seeing this at full speed, picking up what it meant. So now they've added this hashing color to make that a little bit more noticeable, which I think is a great addition. I want to highlight that this hashing can be different colors. So this is the example from one of the trainings at Spring Camp where we introduced or got participants used to this symbol. And so here you can see the hashing changes to green because on the top level, it would be mapped as green, whereas here and over here, it's the pavement color on top. So obviously this control 7 would be in the corner of a parkade on the lower level. And then lastly, I wanted to introduce the new passable wall symbol. So previously this thick gray line, you're allowed to cross it, is still allowed to cross, but now it's this stone wall symbol that we're used to. Thinner black line with the dots. They've added a new flavor to that called the retaining wall, which is here. The dots are only on one side and they're on the low side. So they've added this sort of bit of extra information. This wall would be easier to jump down than it might be to climb up if you're coming in this direction. And so there are other small changes, but these are the three that I think might impact your race. Previously, I would only ever look for black, and so I wouldn't be worried about crossing impassable walls, whereas now I have to sort of retrain myself to not think of this as one of these, as an impassable wall. Okay, so at the World Championships right now, in theory, medals are awarded in sprint for 3 categories. There's the sprint, which we're all used to. There's a sprint relay. I found this fun graph from Wikipedia. So you can see here in 2001, they introduced the sprint. And then in 2014, they introduced this sprint relay, which is 2 male, 2 female, just like a forest relay, but for sprints. And then as of last year, they changed the World Championships to being forest year. And then this year was supposed to be the first sprint walk. Obviously, it's been postponed, but to do that, they added a new format to the World Championships called the knockout sprint. So I'll explain now a little bit about what that's all about. So the knockout sprint is unique and a bit different in that competitors are given 3 samples with different variations of a portion of the course on them before the race starts. And they're given 20 seconds to choose which variation they want to run during the race. I'll try and make that clear in a sec. So these races are short. They're only 7 to 10 minutes long. They run an individual qualifier, and then they run a quarterfinal, semifinal, and final, all in mass starts of 6 runners. So this means that in theory, all 6 people could choose the same forking, and then they're running an unforked orienteering race, or you could be the only one who chose yours. The IOF chose this format as their new format because it would be easy to understand for spectators. It's easy to see the winner when the first person across the line is the winner. And they wanted to be able to cover the whole map with television coverage. With quite short races and looping through the arena being encouraged, this format only requires a very small area. From your perspective, you can think, hey, that means I only need a small map to put on a good race. So we actually tried this at Spring Camp in 2018. Here are the 3 samples that the competitor would be given. You can go ahead and have a look there and see which one you might choose. You can see that they all have the same starting point. They all have the same finishing point, and there's differences in between. You can see that, yes, it's a small but sufficiently technical area. And At this time, IOF was still evaluating these formats, so we gave 30 seconds for people to decide, and we only did it in groups of 4. It turned out to be quite volunteer intensive, especially obviously on the start line. And then also we had to print 200 extra maps that didn't get used. I think that's, I'll get into it, but we don't run this format at Spring Camp anymore, in part to not print 200 extra maps. And so if you chose correctly, you chose option C. Our star course planner, Ben Smith, did a whole analysis, which you can read if you're interested. But you can see here, well, let me explain first. So this part 1 and this part 2, in this example, would be the same for all competitors. And then when you hit number 11 on part 3, you'd be here. And you run this 1, 2, 3, here's your 11, 12, 13. And then all competitors would have the same 16, 17, 18. So that's kind of fun. Here's one other example from the World Cup knockout sprint last year in Switzerland. Here you can see that the competitors only had to choose which 3 to go to. There's a 3B, 3A, 3C. Turned out that 5 out of 6 chose B, only 1 chose A. This format leads to very tight results, right? These 5 runners ran in a pack the whole race. So personally, I'm undecided on this format. I enjoy the head-to-head racing of running an unforked course against other people. But I don't really like the choose your own forking ahead of time. If you want to, the YouTube, like the television coverage, is actually quite good. So you can watch the whole race. It only takes 6 minutes. So from that perspective, they're correct. It makes for an exciting race. I find it hard to believe that this would take off in other categories. I think in younger and older categories where there's more variability in running speed, I'm not sure this would work so well. So we'll see if this one makes it over the water. I think the Seattle Adventure Running Tournament deserves a bit of a plug here. So this, if you haven't heard of it, Patrick Nuss in Seattle, Cascade Club, designed this wonderful event. It started in 2015. I won't go into detail on this bracket, but it's not nearly as scary as it looks. So his weekend has a time trial for initial seeding, and then 5 races, which all have 5 runner mass starts. So, but these 4 are all unforked. So it's like you're in a knockout sprint, but you've all chosen the same forking. And then he forks the final, which interestingly for here, like the knockout sprint format, it benefits stronger runners, right? If you can make it through the qualifier, you don't necessarily need to be as technically strong. Following plays a much bigger part of the game in the knockout sprint than it does in regular orienteering. So at SART every year, we usually have 1 or 2 people that make it to the last round sheerly on running speed, and then they have a tough time in the forking. But this is where, on the West Coast at least, we've practiced head-to-head unforked course racing. And it can be a lot of fun. There are different challenges, you know, there's almost that track and field aspect of when to make your move, when to try and get ahead. And then, yeah, a bit of strategy in sort of how you might do that too. Okay, but let's get back to GVOC. And I mean, what do we do, and what are the benefits that we get from that? So on these next 2 slides, I've highlighted some of the key benefits that I think GVOC gets from our sort of sprint-oriented culture. So first, it's much easier to organize these events, right? We put on a Wednesday evening training all year, and because they're fairly simple to course plan, we can share that load amongst many people in the club. And if everybody only does one, it's really not a lot of work. And then for these, we only put out pin flags. And then right now, we don't even put out anything. We're doing them virtually at the moment with this Map Run F app. which actually has still been quite successful. We get 30 people out a week. Secondly, I think this is the big one for me. They're a lot more accessible. So not every club has great forest terrain. GVOC is definitely included in that. We've got a couple good forest maps, but really if you want to train in the forest, you have to go to Kamloops or Whistler. But every club has good sprint terrain. And I know some people are thinking, oh, I'm not sure if we do, but hopefully by the end of this, you'll be like, oh, hey, maybe we do too. There's less distance to the venue. You know, you can pop out on a Wednesday night, run a course, and it opens up all new terrain types, which we'll see in a second as well. I think the maps are a lot easier to make. In GVOC, we have a lot of people who will pop out and make a little sprint map. But if you've tried, obviously making the forest maps quite a bit more involved. Sprints are quite a bit easier to promote. We've had good success with schools. If you map a school's campus, they're usually pretty excited to use it. But I really want to highlight these last two as well. Sprint has a much lower learning curve. And when we get new members out in Vancouver, they're usually quite excited to be able to run against their peers. And especially if you're a fast runner in the forest, that can take quite a while. We all know how hard proper forest orienteering can be. But when you come out to sprint, you can get to that kind of acceptable level fairly quickly, which means you can have a lot more fun, right? People have fun when they're succeeding in these things. And then lastly, I mentioned earlier, these Wednesday evening trainings, this embracing sprint maps allows us to do this all year round. And because of that, we train more and we train in the night. We added a night out to sprint camp a couple of years ago, and I was very surprised at how many people came and said they never run in the dark. I think NITO, if you listen to Jeff Teutsch's talk on the last speaker series, he talks about optical accommodation. So that's one thing that NITO practices. For me, it's basically that ability to take more shorter map glances. You certainly can't run and study your map in the dark for a bunch of reasons, but I think embracing NITO is a good way to make yourself better orienteering as well. So GVOC's maps, I think this is kind of our biggest asset. So here you can see a portion of our maps. This zooms out a little bit more, but we have over 100 maps in and around Greater Vancouver. A lot of this is thanks to kind of Thomas and Magnus and Megan and Louise when they were sort of building the club a while ago. But we still do have some fairly active mappers. Updating's a lot of work, obviously, but then also creating some new ones. And so, I mean, this is partly what I talk about when I talk about accessibility, right? No matter where you live in town, at least once a year, the Wednesday evening training's going to be fairly close to your house. And then also, when you look at this, I mean, there's no way that Vancouver has this much terrain and where you live has none, right? There has to be something nearby. The other thing I think you might be thinking is there's no way those are all good quality sprint maps. And there you'd definitely be right. We have some highlights. We have some of the major campuses, some good city maps that we typically reserve for spring camp or big, BC Champs competitions. But a lot of our maps are like this, right? So this is a small map. It's 1 to 2,500. It's basically just a city block. What are you going to do with this? So this is the first interesting format I want to introduce. So this is the relay from Sprint Camp in 2016. We run a mass start relay in teams of 2. We run alternating loops, and the first one back obviously is the winner. And at this point, now you look at this map and you say, hey, that looks pretty fun. I'd like to run that. Whereas looking at this, you're like, oh, no, thank you. So here now we're having a lot of fun, but then down here, we're also practicing some pretty good orienteering skills. It takes practice to change direction fast and accurately. And it takes practice to concentrate when there's a bunch of different flags that aren't yours and a bunch of different runners going different directions. So that's our first example of small maps. And then also, so at Spring Camp, we do a 2-person relay and a Farsta, a 1-man relay. And these are both fan favorites. People always rave about how much fun they are. So this is the Farsta from Spring Camp 2017. You can see again, the map is quite small. You couldn't fit a 3-kilometer proper sprint in here without looping around like this. So this is another format that I think is quite helpful to make fun of these areas. And there is, you can see, at least some difficult sprint orienteering here. And then add on that challenge, that speed, and other people running around, makes it a lot of fun. So those 2 maps I would classify as, I mean, we use them for Sprint Camp, but really they're training maps. And a lot of our 100+ maps fall into this category. They're great maps. They're definitely worth making, but they're not competition ready. You can't hold a sprint there. So those 2 were too small. Other reasons, I mean, one of them was also too easy. And then some of your maps, especially when we run, 50+ events every year, they get overused. So we have some maps that we've run on just way too many times, and people know each individual tree. So I'll show you in a sec some formats to make those interesting again as well. This one here I want to highlight. It's too urban. I couldn't come up with a better name, but this is right downtown Vancouver. And if you've been, this is West Georgia and Burrard, and these are big streets. We could never close them. We can't have competitors running across them, but it's actually a very good sprint map. So we can use this for Wednesday evening trainings, and people don't mind stopping at stoplights. Or I'm sure most people have run an Otrivals course before, but this is a great format to use maps that are too urban like this. So in Otrivals, you have a short course like this. This example can be done by 1 person. Often we run them with slight forkings. We'll have 2 or 3 people kind of race it together. The idea here is that you all finish together, and then you can safely cross whatever major streets you have, jog along to the next one, and then start orienteering again. So this, I think, makes great sense on these 2 urban maps. We also occasionally use it on our, overused or too easy maps. Dog bones is a format for your overused and your too easy maps for sure. So in this, we have pairs of controls that need to be taken together, but can be taken in either order. So here you can go 10A to 10B, 10B to 10A, and then 12A to 12B. And this really adds some fun back for me to maps that we've used too many times, or maps that are a little bit too easy. So this is Vanier Park. We've run here a bunch. But now if you went to do this training as you're doing the orienteering, a little bit of tricky orienteering here, you also have to be kind of solving this distance optimization problem. It's a bit like a Scoro, right? But with constraints. And then if you read the Orienteering Officials 100 manual, they've got these other formats listed in it. I don't think Island, Line, and Corridoro are particularly great for sprint maps. I think they play a lot better in the forest. But we do some Memory O as well. Memory O has a bunch of different variations, and again, it's quite good for your overused and your too easy maps. And then I want to encourage you to have fun with it. So here's a couple other fun formats that we've done over the years. This is a great one. This is the Tide-O. So we mapped the sandbanks of Jericho at extremely low tide. This is an indoor O, so 4 levels of a building with some constraints. And then this is an outdoor multi-level O. Our SFU map is complicated to the point of being unmappable. There's too many levels in one spot, and the mapping standard can't handle it. But Ben, again, came up with this great way to show all 5 levels in one area. And so that was quite a fun thing we did one year at Spring Camp as well. So you might be thinking, okay, this sounds great, but I don't have any of those maps. So here's some tips and tools to get you started. So there's lots of publicly available data in Vancouver. It's on the web. It's quite easy. I'm sure it's available where you are as well, but you might have to ask your city. And then I'll introduce 3 tools here. The first one is Open Orienteering Map, which is this fun website out of the UK that will generate street or pseudo maps instantly for you. So I've compared a couple of them here to our web maps. You can see they're obviously not sprint orienteering quality, but if you don't have anything else, these are a great way to get started. I mean, you can go out on a run for this for sure. And then also, if you're making a map, I think it would be quite helpful to get started. It gives you your major trails and your streets and things like that. So that's something fun to check out around where you live. And then the second is Open Orienteering Mapper, which is an open source software for drawing maps. So I use this. I think a lot of people in our club do as well. I think it's quite a bit easier than OCAD to get started with, right? It's a little bit simple. It's a little bit less powerful, but that comes with a lower learning curve. And I think, too, I would encourage everybody to get at least a little bit of skill to the point where you can, if you're setting a course, you know, and they've added a new fence or taken off a couple trees, you can just jump in and make those modifications yourself. It's quite handy. And then, of course, there's OCAD, which is the paid orienteering mapping software. I wanted to highlight here that it has this new one-click map feature as well. So you can load down the free 14-day trial and crank out a bunch of maps. They turned out to be about the same as the Open Orienteering map quality, at least in North America. I think in Europe, this is the one they boast. I think they're pulling data from publicly available GIS systems as well to be able to do that. OCAD's great. It can load a lot of data in automatically for you, so making a map can be a little bit easier. But like I said, it'll take a little bit longer to get started with, I think, because it's quite a bit more complicated. So hopefully that can help you get started, even if you can just download some of this data and go for a run in your neighborhood. And that's kind of everything I wanted to talk about. Hopefully, like I said, you've got some inspiration for fun things to do on your little local maps. And then, of course, you're always welcome to come out and check us out at Spring Camp and see what it is we do here. If you've got any questions, just jump in the chat there and let us know.
Oh, great. Thanks, Graeme. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. We do have a few questions that have come in.
Right.
Let's start. Do you have any tips for somebody course planning for sprint? It's pretty different than forest orienteering.
Yeah.
Do you have some tips?
I do. So first off, we're looking at doing another one of these talk series, probably with Megan, about like exclusively about that. So we'll try and put on a sprint orienteering course planning masterclass. So I didn't talk too much about it here. I did prepare a little appendix slide here for that. So my tips would be keep that emphasis on route choice, right? Think about what makes, in your opinion, a good sprint and try and emulate that. So this is one of the trainings I did for Spring Camp this year. I really started with planning this leg. You can see the options here. Going down these stairs and above is 20 to 50 meters shorter. So I wanted to kind of trick people to go one of these ways, but at least to provide that option. And then I would really recommend, if you haven't, at least though 100, it's got a lot of good, like your basic things to avoid, right? So avoiding dog legs, not putting controls in illegal locations, not having bingo controls, things like that. And then my other tip is to have 50-50 legs as your transition legs. So this leg from 3 to 4, it isn't hard. you might only lose a second if you go above instead of below, but it's the fact that they have to make a choice. And so each leg you have to think, you know, it's not just down the road, okay, and then the next one's interesting. But if you need to do a transition leg, at least try and make it a little bit of a 50-50. So those are my tips, but hopefully Megan can do a better job.
Thanks, Graeme. We had a question come in from Jennifer, and she was asking about the Map Run F events that you're doing now, the virtual events, and she was just wondering if you could tell us more about how that works and how the results are published. And she's just curious how many people are participating versus your normal weekly trainings.
Yeah, good. We're definitely getting less people. Like I said, kind of, I think last week we had 30, but it's kind of in the 20 to 30 range most weeks. Typically for a wet at this time of the year, now that it's not dark and raining, we would expect kind of 50. And it does a bit depend on the location of the map. Again, sort of central maps will get more, further out maps will get a little less. There's been quite good feedback. People typically are still printing the map. So for those that don't know, you load the map onto the app, and then it uses your GPS. And when you get close to the location, your phone will bingle and say, okay, you're there, go on to the next one. A lot of our participants are printing a color copy of the map so that they can race with that and just have their phone on loud in their pocket to do the control registration and the results. So I think some people have been trying to navigate off their phone, and I don't think that's quite as successful. You can see the results on the app, depending how the organizers set it up. We're still pulling those results manually and posting them to our GVOC website, because people also email in their time if they've gone out and run it just with a piece of paper. I think that's kind of all the information I have for it. You can check it out. We've got a decent explanation. If you go on GVOC's page, you'll see we have a virtual event each week on our webpage, and on any of those, there'll be kind of an explanation that we have written up about how to get started with it for our events. So I assume you could use that as well to try it out. I came back to this slide to talk about this because you can load these maps directly into the app. So if you wanted to, you could load this on your phone. You could set a course here, there, and then you could go out and run it with your phone, and it would tell you if you're at those spots. So I think that's quite cool, right? You could go orienteering tonight without doing anything, just downloading it on your phone.
To follow up on that, I think both Foothills Orienteering and Alberta Orienteering have some resources on their websites about how to do that and the ins and outs of exactly how to do that.
Okay.
Graeme, we did get a thanks back from Jennifer saying that was really helpful.
Okay, great.
A question from Olivier, and he was wondering about how it works in Vancouver in terms of city authorization to run training events and events. Can you talk a little bit about what GVOC's process is with authorizations? Yeah.
So I mean, permits can be a bit of a struggle. We don't always get permits for our Wednesday evening trainings. Well, we basically never do. So we try and keep those. I mean, we don't get the volume of people that can necessarily make a scene. We get permits always for our Sunday races, anything that's big, anything that we're also, I think there's some difference because we collect money for them. So any of our Sunday events are permitted. Our maps are all over the place, so it kind of depends what district you're in, right? Whether you go to North Van or Vancouver. Typically, there's no problem there. Sometimes we have to commit to staying on trails or things like that. I personally am not particularly involved in the permitting process. I know we don't permit our trainings. I mean, most of them were just a group of friends, a running group meeting at this park to go run. We don't really have an impact. I think one thing we do try and avoid is high density housing complexes. So this isn't a great example, but it's the only one I've got in the slides here. You can see we've out of bounds these housing complexes, mostly just because it's a little rude to like run quite close to people's houses, you know, some Wednesday night in the dark in the winter. Yeah, so I think that's all I've got about permits.
Yeah, I think there just is a real variety of regulations across the country. So definitely need to check in with your local government to see how it would work in your community.
I think this kind of example here I have, you can go run that on a Wednesday night, no problem, right? We're a group of friends getting together for a run.
Graeme, Ann's asking about quotation older orienteers who don't run much and aren't necessarily so keen on sprints. So they say, I don't run, therefore I don't do sprints. Do you have any comments on that? How can we get them to embrace sprint? Should we even bother trying? So how does it work? Because you guys do so many sprints in Vancouver. How does it work with some of your quote older athletes?
Yeah, that's quite a good question. I think in Vancouver, if you don't sprint, there's not a lot of orienteering you can do. You can come once a month, but really the most fun is these ones. I think, yeah, I mean, I understand the viewpoint, right? I prefer to run fast. Sprint orienteering is easy enough that if you're going really slow, potentially it's not hard enough to be enjoyable. I think really you need to plan courses that really focus on route choice. I think regardless of what speed you're going, you know, this is an interesting leg. You might have some difficulty like deciding that this is the shortest. If you don't catch that it's on that side, maybe you'll go this way for sure. I think typically we hear that from people that haven't tried enough interesting sprints. So try it, you might like it. And then, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, John Rance just wrote in the chat, you know, it's a challenge for everyone just to do it as fast as you can, whatever that speed is. So.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that would be the thing, right? We have orienteers from all ages in Vancouver who love it. So John would certainly have a great perspective, and I'm sure any of them would be willing to tell you why they love it too.
Jeff wrote, the emphasis needs to be on good courses. If you aren't enjoying sprint, you probably aren't running on interesting enough courses.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, I think that was what I was trying to describe here.
Marion has a question about how GVOC deals with version control on your dozens and dozens of maps that you have.
Ooh, not well would be my first point. So yeah, we've got a lot of maps. There's a server. Mostly it comes down to the volunteer that's working on that at the moment. So at the moment, if you are putting on a wet, maybe at this park, and you notice things are a little out of whack, you can make those changes. You email it to Ben. He updates it on the website. Certainly some of ours, if you go look at the GVOC map, it's out of date. So volunteering to keep that server up to date is a bit of a challenge. But yeah, otherwise it's pretty free for all. You can make a map, you can make changes, and then you can email it in. There is a mapping, like a section of our executive, which is dedicated to mapping, but that typically focuses more on, you know, spring camp quality maps as opposed to little wet maps that I might make, kind of thing.
Thanks, Graeme. Are there any more questions?
I put this resources slide here at the end, so can pause the recording and check. I pulled a lot of examples for this presentation from the O100 and then the O200 and the O300 course planning. I would recommend if you're planning a lot of sprints and you want more depth. I also, when doing this, read a lot on the IOF. It's a little tricky to find things on their website, but they've got some good examples as well of kind of what makes a good sprint. And then there's the new mapping standard and a description of the new format.
Graeme, we had another question coming in asking about the best sprint you ever ran.
Oh, now that's tricky. I think, so for me, you have to kind of categorize these things a bit, right? I've run sprints in Europe on extremely small maps with little alleys that are very, very tricky and really fun and have that sustained difficulty and keep your mental focus really high. So those are really high on the list, but also I do want to call attention to this have fun with it slide. Often when I think about the best times I've had orienteering, it's things like this. You know, we run this, when do you get to run a race barefoot, splashing around in the tide pools, right? Or we have a map, I should have put it here too, on top of the Squamish Chief. So it's all open rock, the view is phenomenal. You know, your sprint orienteering, debatably, but you're on top of a mountain, so that's pretty cool. So good sprints because they're hard, and good sprints because they're just so much fun.
Yeah, I'd probably put a plug in for a sprint at the Hopewell Rocks at the Bay of Fundy at low tide.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about here.
Yeah. We do have a message from Rob, well, not a message, a comment from Robin just about wanting to see more people at Sprint Camp, hopefully 2021. So this will be Sprint Camp number 16. And then also, you mentioned the Seattle Adventure Running Tournament, and I think anyone who has a chance to head to Seattle should give that event. That should be on every orienteer's bucket list, I think.
Yeah, it's a ton of fun, and I mean, I think again it'll be interesting to see. I didn't sort of realize that I'd been running knockout sprints for 5 years already. I didn't know the format was going to take off, and it's just a lot of fun.
Okay, Graeme, I think that's the last of the questions. So I want to thank you very much. I'm really grateful for your willingness to do this and working with you over the last couple of weeks to get this ready. If you wouldn't mind just forwarding to the one slide that has the topic for our next Let's Talk Orienteering speaker series. We've just confirmed this, and information has just gone up on our social media. So it's next Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern, and there's 4 athletes from Orienteering Canada's high performance program that are going to talk about different aspects of high level orienteering. We've got Emma Waddington, Robbie Graham, Christian Michelson, and Emily Kemp, and it's going to be moderated by our high performance manager, Jeff Teutsch. So if you go to Orienteering Canada's social media, that's where you'll find the link to register. And as Tracy mentioned at the beginning, we are recording this, and it will be up on Orienteering Canada's YouTube in a few days. So thank you, Graeme, and thanks to everyone who joined us.
No problem. Thanks for coming out.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Thank you.